I just spent a few days last week at an institute. One of the participants was the guy who did the Marlboro Man campaign. And he assured me that advertising only worked when it was true. Just to give you an idea of how the other side thinks. Anyway, my contention was that Americans by and large turned against the government in the 1930s. We're going to hear 4 perspectives on this, whether it is true, why it is true, and perhaps give us some idea about how we can change it. I'm going to introduce the speakers as they talk. On my left, and the first to speak is Bob Herbert. He is one of those people who does not need an introduction. I apologize for using that terrible phrase. He was a New York Times prominent columnist for many years, a prominent journalist even before that. He probably doesn't remember, but at NBC he and I shared an office. Do you remember that?
I do remember.
Yeah. In any case, Bob's going to talk about this issue. Thank you, Bob, for coming.
I'm going to, I hope everyone can hear. Got my cheaters on. I remember when I was a young wonderkin in the newspaper business, and then suddenly I became the elder statesman, and then I had to wear reading glasses, and then other terrible things happened that we're not going to talk about. I don't know when all that stuff happened. First, it's an honor to be able to speak here today. It's tough following my friend Joe Stiglitz. I don't know why that has to happen, but I want to thank Felicia. I want to thank Jeff. I want to thank Ms. Roosevelt, and thank everyone for coming. I'm going to deviate just a little from the topic of our panel. I don't think most Americans have turned against government. In fact, there are a lot of people, and I'm one of them, who wish government would do more. But people across the political spectrum have lost confidence in government. And they're seeing what we're seeing every day, that the United States seems lost, incapable of getting its act together. It seems to have lost its way. And we've, in that context, we've witnessed one catastrophe after another: the Iraq War, New Orleans and the flooding that followed Hurricane Katrina, the virtual collapse of the American economy. And there are so many things that we seem unable as a society to do. We once did them, but we don't seem to be able to do them anymore. We can't rebuild the nation's infrastructure. We can't revitalize the public schools. Above all, we've shown ourselves incapable of putting people back to work in any substantial way in jobs that can support a middle-class standard of living. So there are not a lot of reasons to believe that the people tasked with running the country have any real sense, vision, of where we should be going as a society, much less how to get there. But that's not the same as turning against the government. We haven't yet declared that matters are hopeless. Americans still have tremendous respect, for example, for the armed forces, even though the public has turned against the war in Afghanistan. Most still cling to Social Security and Medicare. Most send their children to public schools. People continue to pay their taxes. Americans are not yet ready to say, as extreme conservatives do, that government should just get out of the way. Most Americans would like their government to do better. Another point I would make is that this erosion in confidence began as, and I agree with Jeff, that began a long time ago. I sort of established it with Vietnam. And it accelerated with Watergate and the many assorted scandals that erupted in the last quarter of the 20th century. A widely held view now, correct in my opinion, is that government has formed a toxic alliance with the economic elite in this country and has not looked out for the interests of ordinary Americans. But that, again, is not the same as turning against government. I think most Americans are still hungry for leadership that will guide the nation out of the wilderness, that will reestablish a sense of purpose for the United States, and above all, will pursue policies that will put most people back to work. That's what people were looking for with Barack Obama in 2008. The people who put their faith in Obama were putting their faith in government. I don't think Obama has delivered nearly as well as he might have, even taking into account the disgraceful behavior of the Republican Party. So there is still a vacuum of leadership and a hunger for that vacuum to be filled. I'll wrap this up with a reference to a couple of past presidents. Franklin Roosevelt, in his first inaugural address, delivered in the deep gloom of the Great Depression, said our greatest primary task is to put people to work. And he added that we should treat that task as we would treat the emergency of a war. Nearly 80 years later, Roosevelt's words ring as loudly and resonantly and as truthfully as ever. The other president is one we don't hear a lot about, Lyndon Johnson. Even at Democratic conventions, you'll hear plenty of references to Jack Kennedy and Bill Clinton and FDR, but not LBJ. I recently reread Johnson's Great Society speech, which he delivered as the commencement address at the University of Michigan on May 22nd, 1964. The country was still trying to get back to normal after the trauma of the Kennedy assassination 8 months earlier, and Johnson was laying out what amounted to a sense of national purpose, an explicit statement of what the United States, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, should be about. An audience of 80,000 in the school's athletic stadium listened to the speech, and it was very well received. But as I look back over what is now nearly 5 decades, it seems as though no one ever really listened, paid attention to what Johnson was saying. As with so much of what we see and hear regarding national policy and public life, it was in one ear and out the other. For a century, said Johnson, we labored to settle and to subdue a continent. For half a century, we called upon unbounded invention and untiring industry to create an order of plenty for all of our people. The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. Johnson called upon the citizens of America to build a society that is much more than just rich and powerful. He envisioned a society that demanded an end to poverty, a society in which the people were more concerned with the quality of their goals, as he put it, than with the quantity of their goods, a society that in the great tradition of the American dream offered boundless opportunity to the youngest among us. Well, nearly 50 years have gone by, and we haven't even come close to realizing LBJ's dream of a great society. We're losing the fight against poverty and the fight for good jobs in America. Nearly 50 million Americans are poor, including 1 of every 5 American children. Another 50 million people, the so-called near poor, live just a notch or two above the official poverty line, earning less than $36,000 a year for a family of 3. In other words, 100 million Americans, nearly 1/3 of the entire population, are poor or can feel the awful flames of poverty licking at their heels. Peter Edelman, in his new book, So Rich, So Poor, points out that 1/4 of all the jobs in the United States pays less than $11 an hour. You cannot rebuild a middle class with wages like that. Over the past half century, we've badly underachieved as a society, fallen well short of America's magnificent promise. The United States needs to be reimagined. We need to make a serious effort to find out who we really are and what we should be about. Lyndon Johnson's vision of a great society might be a good place to begin that imaginative process. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Glad there's somebody on this panel who with me can remember LBJ.
I don't remember. I read about him.
He's joking. Just two quick orders of business. We are going to have time for a discussion period with the audience. We want to involve you. I think we have some procedure to get you to talk into a mic. I also wanted to point out that all of you have on your seat a copy of The Nation, an issue devoted to the very issues we're discussing today, which I edited with Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and she so generously made available to everybody at this conference. And I should also add thanks to our crack staff who did the really hard editing. I'm delighted that Kim Phillips-Fein can join us. I read her book called Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal. I think it set the stage for one of the main issues of our time. How much did business and vested interests and wealthy people have to do with changing our minds? It accords a bit with what Joe Stiglitz says. How do we create values? It was an extremely fine book. She is a professor at NYU and a mother who had to run away, I think, from her child to come to talk to us for a bit. And then she's going back to teach. Kim, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm actually going to stand up, I think, just to be able to stand up. So thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I'm just really grateful to Jeff for inviting me, to everybody for coming. And I think the subject of this panel, the question that we were asked to consider, why Americans turned against their government, contains within it, I think, several assumptions. Most importantly, I suppose, the sense that there was a time not that long ago when most Americans were not so hostile to government, and also a sense of what that government was supposed to do. And I think my response to that question is that, in fact, one of the things that we need to do to understand, to start to think about changing our politics today, is to understand that that vision of an activist government was never one that was widely accepted or free from conflict. Even when it was much more widely held, it continued to be something that attracted a great deal of hostility, in particular from certain parts of the business elite. Not the entire business community, but some particular portions of it were always deeply invested, really almost from the creation of this more expansive vision of the state and of collective action. And they sought for a long while afterwards to find ways to turn the tide of opinion and to turn the support of politicians against that type of state. So even when they were not able to actually enact these ideas, they were organizing to seek to change the situation. So we often think of the New Deal as the origin point for modern American liberalism, and FDR is one of the best loved American presidents, whose accomplishments, everything from the creation of regulations for the financial and banking system, to the labor laws that guaranteed working people the right to organize unions, to the creation of Social Security and the first federal programs for women and children, to the first national wage and minimum wage and hour laws, to the public works programs that helped to develop the South and Southwest economically, as well as put people back to work during the worst economic crisis in our history. And beyond all of these, the simple fact of the federal government taking responsibility to help people and provide them with material aid, all of these we see, and rightly so, as deeply popular accomplishments. The New Deal created in many ways what we have today of a welfare state, an idea of a dynamic liberalism. And these programs were, of course, beloved by many, but not by all. And I think the 1930s should also be seen as the decade that gives us the beginnings of our modern reaction against this type of liberalism, a reaction that ultimately grows into the conservative movement that gains strength later in the 20th century, which gave us Ronald Reagan and ultimately even George W. Bush, and in some sense, the Tea Party movement. The conservative movement, when we talk about it today, we often see it as focused primarily on social issues, and many historians have suggested that its real roots are in the backlash against the civil rights movement and feminism, gay rights, and the anti-war movement. The idea being that ordinary middle and working class people were troubled by the radicalism of the late 1960s and 1970s and reacted by turning to the right and electing Reagan. But I think that looking at the real origins in the backlash against the New Deal helps us to see the conservative movement more clearly, emphasizing its longevity and its focus on matters related to economic policies long before the backlash against the New Left in the 1960s. We often think of post-war history in terms of the long period of growth and economic expansion in the mid-20th century, an era of labor management accord when there was relative peace between employers and workers. But in fact, there were many business people who were fierce critics of post-war liberalism, even at its height, and who sought to find ways to undermine it and to fight unions and a vision of an activist state, even when these were at their strongest. And I would argue that this long reaction does much to explain why we are in the situation we are today. So I'm just going to speak briefly about a few of the kind of key moments and organizations in this long fight against the New Deal. In some ways, this really begins in the 1930s with the Liberty League, the National Association of Manufacturers, and other public relations and political campaigns. The Liberty League, in particular, was financed by a very small number of business people, most notably the DuPont family, who denounced the, quote, ravenous madness of the New Deal, arguing that the dragon teeth of class warfare are being sown with a vengeance, that the New Deal was leading to a, quote, totalitarian centralization of power, that it was creating a bureaucracy that was, quote, spreading its tentacles over the business and private life of the citizens of the country. The Liberty League failed fairly quickly, disappearing after the 1936 re-election of Roosevelt, although not before it kind of tried to make Social Security a central, and kind of a opposition to Social Security a central part of Alf Landon's campaign. But although the business conservatives had to accept this political failure, they continued to seek to try to support conservative and free market intellectuals, believing that the struggle would continue in the ideological realm. A former DuPont vice president became one of the major financial supporters of Friedrich von Hayek and his Mont Pelerin Society. The book The Road to Serfdom, of course, remains a conservative movement classic. The American Enterprise Association, now the American Enterprise Institute, was started during the 1940s by a businessman determined to bring the voice of business back into American politics. The National Association of Manufacturers conducted massive public relations campaigns. Historian Elizabeth Fones-Wolf has described how the number of, they blanketed the country with pamphlets, 2 million in 1947, 6.5 million by 1949, 8 million by 1950, pamphlets. One 1952 ad that they financed just kind of started out saying, "They don't keep feeding you cheese after the trap is sprung. And once you vote into office, a welfare state, you will lose your freedom." So even in I think the next kind of, after the moment of the 1930s and the immediate post-war period, the next kind of critical moment for business organizing comes in the late 1950s, when the country is in the first serious recession of the post-war years, and shortly after the combination of the AFL and the CIO into a single union federation with a unified political arm. One side of this was a new interest in union-busting strategies. The National Association of Manufacturers begins to hold management training sessions, instructing employers in strategies they can use to fight organizing drives. The number of unfair labor practices begins to rise sharply in the late 1950s, and the proportion of union victories in elections starts to fall. But the other side of this offensive was political. In the fall of 1958, for example, Fortune magazine publishes an essay arguing that the American corporation has rediscovered politics. The president of Gulf Oil said, "Whether we want to be there or not, Gulf and every other American corporation is up to its ears in politics. We must either start swimming or drown." Companies began to organize workshops and seminar series on political action, instructing managers on how to run for political office, how to do door-to-door campaigning, how to organize a precinct. Company publications began to tout political issues. General Electric manager publishes a book called The Businessman's Guide to Practical Politics, saying that businessmen need to get involved in fighting, quote, "a tightly organized and highly centralized group of organized labor leaders whose basic objective of collective bargaining has now become a secondary function, replaced by a new objective of seizing political power and ultimately control of government." GE was really at the forefront of these efforts under the leadership of Lemuel Ricketts Boulware, its vice president of human relations, who tried to turn GE into something of an enormous think tank devoted to free market economic ideas. He strongly encouraged all managers to regularly read the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and other conservative publications. Each supervisor for some time received a copy of The Road Ahead, a short book by John Flynn that portrayed the New Deal as the first step down the road to totalitarianism. Supervisors were encouraged to hold study groups and sort of reading sessions at their homes in the off hours. At the same time, workers, this was not just GE, many companies in the 50s did this, were supposed to go to classes on company time on the basic principles of free market ideas. Boulware supported the relocation of GE factories from northern cities that were unionized to southern states, southwestern states as well, with right-to-work laws. And of course, one of the, in some ways, the most famous activists to come through the GE program was Ronald Reagan, who I think Rick may talk about later, I'm not sure. So despite the efforts of Boulware, most of the corporate community did not unify around the politics of opposition to the New Deal in the 1950s or 1960s. In the 70s, though, there is a sharp shift. For some, this is symbolized by the famous Powell Memorandum, written by Lewis Powell, who was at the time a prominent Richmond lawyer on the board of director of several corporations, past president of the ABA, whose friend Eugene Sydnor asked him after a series of discussions about politics to write a memo that he could give to the Chamber of Commerce to describe a way for the Chamber, which was at that time a fairly sleepy organization, to get more active in politics. And Powell's memo is titled Attack on the Free Enterprise System. It argues that the free enterprise system is facing a sustained attack. He talks a little bit about the new left, but then really says the main force of this is not coming from radicals, but is coming from the mainstream elements of society which are turning against business, and that businessmen in response need to become activists in the ideological war. They should actively strive to shape the political debate on college campuses, organizing speakers bureaus, evaluating textbooks. They should fund special TV programs. They should form programs to mobilize stockholders. Political power, they should use the courts to win rights for business. Political power, he wrote, is necessary. Such power should be assiduously cultivated. It must be used aggressively and with determination. And the Powell Memorandum, I think it's important to recognize it doesn't kind of lay out a program that was followed to the letter, but it fell on extremely receptive ears. John M. Olin, who founded the Olin Foundation, wrote to his friend William Baruti at AEI that, quote, the Powell Memorandum gives a reason for a well-organized effort to reestablish the validity and importance of the free market system. The Black and Decker warned stockholders in its letter in 1975 that the hour is getting late. Robert Bork, then a law professor, told the AEI Board of Trustees that business leaders would need to decide if they're really willing to let the corporate system slide and perhaps expire without putting up a determined fight. And all of this leads to a dramatic new wave of business organizing during the 1970s. The expansion of older think tanks, the creation of new ones like the Heritage Foundation, the reinvigoration of the Chamber of Commerce, the creation of the Business Roundtable, which is an organization of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, which seeks, as one consultant put it, to develop a total attack program for business. It also means the first wave of corporate PACs, which were imagined as an effort to retake government and turn it to be more in the interest of business. Justin Dart, the chairman of the board of Dart Industries, a pharmaceutical conglomerate who was known as the Johnny Appleseed of the PAC movement, would speak at these meetings of business people gathered in hotels, telling them that a company without a PAC is, quote, either apathetic, unintelligent, or you've got a death wish. He rejected the idea that PACs were disrupting the political process, saying, I don't advocate that business buy a legislator. Rhetoric is a very fine thing. A little money to go with the rhetoric is better. They listen better. So there is the number of corporate PACs and the kind of and lobbying offices for companies in Washington expands dramatically over this moment in the 1970s. So to sum up, I think when we look back at the post-war years, it's important to not romanticize them as a time when there was a certain kind of unity around support for government activism. There was a very contentious politics that runs throughout the post-war years, a set of fierce conflicts and struggles. And the expansion of government that happens at this moment is never easily accepted by America's business class. And I think the organizing against it, both ideological, intellectual, in the workplace, and also in the political realm, helps to generate the kind of momentum around the politics that we see today. And I would add just one last thing. I'm working now on the 1970s, and especially on New York City during the 1970s, and the wave of austerity programs of that time. And I think that as I've kind of looked at the evolution at New York during these years, and the way in which austerity programs came to be were initially strongly resisted by many New Yorkers, but eventually came to be widely accepted in the wake of the city's fiscal crisis, it has occurred to me that it seems that in many ways shrinking government does not lead to calls for more government, but often really exactly the opposite. So as the public sector is cut back, as labor unions and other kinds of collective organizations that help to create a sense of common purpose are diminished, it actually becomes more difficult to create the support for them. The power of business becomes more evident vis-a-vis the state. People come to feel like they have to act individually and cannot rely on other people or on the society more broadly. The rhetoric of freedom comes to seem something that only applies to individuals, and it's not clear that being part of an organization can actually give you more power. As the capacity of the state shrinks, so too does political imagination. As library programs are diminished, as universities are become inaccessible or are shrunk, as happened in the 70s, as hospitals or parks are eliminated, people start to see government as impoverished, to believe that there are no resources and no way to build collective spaces. So I think one of the great challenges of the present is giving people the ability to, and the sense of confidence and power, to think politically once again, to reclaim this language of power and capacity, so that government does not seem a tool of charity, but rather something that's connected on a deep level to a vision of solidarity and freedom. So.
Next up is the feisty Rick Pearlstein, if you don't mind my saying that. Rick is a columnist for the Rolling Stone these days. He wrote an extremely important book about Barry Goldwater, Before the Storm, which influenced me. Also included, I think, a little bit on Ronald Reagan. I raised him and how he honed the great speech he made for Barry during his GE tenureship, going around the country making speeches for GE. Rick also wrote a celebrated book called Nixonland about a fellow who was president between 1969 and 73 or 74, I forget. Rick has some views about the 1970s. I'm anxious to hear, and I'm sure you all are. Rick?
Thank you so kindly, Jeff. I'm honored and pleased to be here. I came from Hyde Park, the other Hyde Park, not the one in New York, where I was prevented in my long-term project of posting 95 theses on the door of my neighbor, Barack Obama, on the kind of themes we're talking about today by the Secret Service. So I'll have to talk to you guys instead. Kim and I are old friends, and we coordinated our talks today. She kind of did the what, and I'm going to give you a bit of the
Rick,
why.
can you speak closer to the mic or pull it closer to the mic?
She gives you the what of the corporate crusade against labor and liberalism, and I'm going to give a bit of the why. But I wanted to add one note to the what, which is my favorite stuff, which is the kind of what they called education or propaganda. In 1950, the year of Walter Reuther's Treaty of Detroit, the National Association of Manufacturers, which was such an extreme organization, by the way, that they their board had to pass a resolution saying they wouldn't support anyone who questioned the patriotism of Dwight Eisenhower. They circulated no fewer than 4.5 million pamphlets, publications, and comic books to school children. They carried an entire full-time staff to produce its national radio program, Industry on Parade, which ranked among Oklahoma City's top 5 programs and attracted more Milwaukee listeners in its time slot than Meet the Press, which, unlike Industry on Parade, did not have its own singing group. They had a crew traveling the country to deliver 2-day seminars to businessmen, like Kim says. And in 1954, according to historian Elizabeth Phones-Wolf, school superintendents estimated the investment in free materials at $50 million, about half the amount public schools spent annually on regular textbooks. So the ground is being seeded. That's $1/3 billion in today's money. Why? What's the rhetoric? What's the ideology? First of all, political reasons. Governing well in the interests of the broad majority brings compounding political benefits for the party of government. Like Kim says, the possibility that government can do good stuff manufactures an expectation that government will do good stuff. I really love this quote from 1928 that Tom Frank dug up from a former president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, writing in The Nation's Business. "A thoroughly first-rate man in public service is corrosive. He eats holes in our liberties. The better he is and the longer he stays, the greater the danger. If he is an enthusiast, a bright-eyed madman who is frantic to make this the finest government in the world, the Black Plague is a house pest by comparison." That's 1928. Here's the same thing being said in 1933 by William Crystal in his famous memo called Defeating President Clinton's Healthcare Proposal. The reason he wanted to do that was not because it wouldn't work, but because it would work. So he said it has to be defeated, not compromised with. He said, "It will revive the reputation of the party that spends and regulates the Democrats as the generous protector of middle-class interests. And it will at the same time strike a punishing blow against Republican claims to defend the middle class by restraining government." So Crystal's group was Project for a Republican Future. The idea is guaranteed health care, the Republicans have no future. It's a specter that haunts all conservative politics, and it's not unfounded. Democrats have certainly not been above exploiting activist government for political ends. In the fall of 1936, going into the presidential election, FDR's Postmaster General, Jim Farley, who was a deeply political man, who was the Postmaster General and also the DNC chair, directed all post offices to hang a large full-color poster urging everybody working for salary or wage, with only a few exceptions, that's a quote, to sign up for the new Social Security program. In giant cursive script, it promised, quote, "a monthly check to you for the rest of your life, beginning when you are 65, and had a picture of the check being handed to you by Uncle Sam, presumably, with the Capitol Dome looming in the background. By the way, we do things differently now in the Democratic Party. Now it's with the healthcare mandate, it's a monthly check from you for the rest of your life to private business. The party of conservatism, though, the Republicans, has labored mightily ever since to convince the populace that it is business, in fact, operating according to the profit motive that is the generous protector of middle-class interests. And by the way, Farley's own career gives lie to the notion that government can't work. I mean, he also turned America's Postal Service the first in the world that turned a profit by pioneering airmail. Of course, talking about it in this way is not necessarily a good public relations platform, that we don't want government to work. So they don't say they're for ineffective government. It backfires when being held up to public view. In 2007, Michael Baruti, the son of the guy who built up the American Enterprise Institute, was chosen by President Bush to run the Consumer Product Safety Commission until it came out that as a lobbyist for National Association of Manufacturers, he had been recommending things like blocking fire safety regulations for cigarettes, regulations on the tendency of all-terrain vehicles to flip over, warnings to parents that cribs and strollers they bought had been recalled, and preventing government from, quote, silencing commercial speech by banning tobacco ads, billboards near schools. So his name was withdrawn, and the National Association of Manufacturers reacted thus. They said the withdrawal of Michael Baruti's nomination to chair the Consumer Product Safety Commission is a sad day for consumers and everyone who cares about good government. Now, this is not complete bad faith because there's a moral vision about what good government should look like. I'm very impressed by a recent book by Corey Robin called The Reactionary Mind, in which he spells out this moral vision, something that kind of goes back to the 18th century, in very different permutations, very different institutional arrangements, very different order of battle about who the villains are and who the heroes are in different ages, but basically the continuity being a will to power and hierarchy on the part of the governing classes, and a resistance or a reaction, if you will, to any movements that should try to fight hierarchy. And the ideology is one of paternalism. I think the poetic key to the kind of quotes you hear from these business leaders was summarized by a cork manufacturer who wasn't active in this movement. Unless citizens were, quote, thoroughly grounded in knowledge of, faith in, and the practice of the principles on which the American Republic rests, they will be easy prey for demagogues. The consequences of failure, according to General Electric's CEO, who was also the finance chair for Barry Goldwater, Ralph Kortner, was turning over the field to, again, demagogues, that was a word that he used, in government who are hunting for votes regardless of the economic and social consequences, or what Lem Bulwer said, the upper crust of labor, who are willing to pull down civilization just to keep a steady flow of union dues. So we have a will to power on the part of these demagogues. The logic counterposes something akin to revealed truth. I mean, there's a inbred sort of vision, organic kind of vision of how society works that kind of rests on this idea of a businessman's republic, in which kind of businessmen have the right and obligation to govern the society. It counterposes knowledge, principle, faith, those are the words in the quote, on one side to mere will to power on the other. That word demagogues, repeated over and over again. No demagogues on the right, only on the left, buying people's votes. So we get quotes like this. Is it Warren Kinsman was the guy you were referring to? He was the head of, he was from DuPont, and he was the head of NAM's Public Relations Department. He said, in the everlasting battle for the minds of men, only modern marketing techniques were powerful enough to arouse public opinion sufficient to check the steady, insidious, and current drift towards socialism. Now, Lemuel Bulwer's role in this particularly was in convincing factory workers, union members, that this was the way to go. He called it job marketing, and he compared the job of his 3,000 employee relations managers to that of General Electric salesmen, quote, giving a turbine customer the information and guidance that would cause the latter of his own free will to do what we want as to the selection of the equipment and the signing of the order. As Kim mentioned, he hired Reagan. Now, I imagine the Liberty League folks kind of wearing monocles and spats, but Reagan, of course, masters this kind of folksy populist story about conservatism. And as he's doing this, Bulwer is also organizing businessmen in exactly the way that Kim indicated, to go, quote, to go to work in their own and the rest of the public's interest, their own and the rest of the public's interest, by promoting, quote, economic education, proper moral conduct under freedom, and political maturity that proofs the people against demagogues. Moral conduct under freedom. Now, the striking thing about this is while this is going on, General Electric executives are being indicted for price fixing. Basically, the biggest antitrust conspiracy in the 20th century. In its essence, the scandal was a series of interlocking schemes to fix the prices of everything from $2 insulators to multi-million-dollar turbines. It arose out of an economic atmosphere during America's post-war boom when the great industrial giant was facing genuine competition, which they say they want, in its various business lines for the first time in company history. The men who ran GE, according to one of their historians, quote, took a dim view of competition. Now, what emerges in the gap between the two, the defense of free competition and rhetoric and its subversion in practice, is a kind of droit de seigneur, a sort of right to govern, a sort of paternalistic, well, freedom means thinking like we do. Now, interestingly, one consequence of, and I'll just skip over the 70s in a phrase, one consequence of the advancing power and success of conservatism in ordering our public life is precisely that what was once only said in kind of private to each other, we're now hearing more and more in public. And that's where the I think the perception that conservatives are more extreme comes from. I don't think they're more extreme. I just think it's a function of power and prominence. Dahlia Lithwick wrote eloquently about it in the Supreme Court oral arguments about the health care bill. Until today, I couldn't really understand why this case was framed as a discussion of liberty. This case isn't so much about freedom from government mandated broccoli or gyms. It's about freedom from our obligations to one another, freedom from the modern world in which we live. It's about the freedom to ignore the injured, walk away from those in peril, to never pick up the phone or eat food that's been inspected. There was an argument that we regulate phones through interstate commerce, and we have to do that. We have to pay for that. One of the justices says, well, don't use the phone. That's your freedom. It's about the freedom to be left alone. And now we know the court is worried about freedom, the freedom to live like it's 1804. A final example of how this submerged rhetoric is kind of emerging was Rick Santorum's victory speech after the Iowa caucuses, in which, as politicians tend to do in this season of privation, talked about his own family's modest circumstances. And he discussed his grandfather escaping from fascist Italy to come to America, quote, because Mussolini had been in power for 3 years and he had figured out that fascism was something that would crush his spirit and freedom and give his children something less than he wanted for them. He went on to describe the world that his grandpa then inhabited, supposedly the freedom to which he had absconded. He left the coal fields of southern Pennsylvania. He worked in the mine at a company town, got paid with coupons, as he called them. Now let's dwell on that. Coupons, scrip, company town, debt slavery, the inability to move somewhere else, which is the fundamental right of a free person, because they owed their soul to the company's store. This is what Rick Santorum is characterizing as freedom. And nobody in the media, by the way, even noticed. And of course, what had ended that routine of debt slavery for so many millions of Americans? It was state laws, it was federal laws, it was unions acting under the charter of government. It took those institutions to create freedom, where in the most striking and powerful sense, none had existed before. Without them, those freedoms to move and raise your family as you saw fit would not exist. So I think that's what we're here finally and fundamentally to defend and preserve and extend today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Red. I'm delighted to have Joe Sauce here as well. He's one of the nation's leading political scientists. He's at the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, one of Humphrey, at least before roughly 1967 or 1968, was one of the great liberal heroes, New Deal heroes, I would say. I'm not sure what his most prominent book was, but he did write Unwanted Claims, The Politics of Participation in the U.S. Welfare System, and a slew of others. He's thought about these issues deeply, written about them profoundly. Joe? Please.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'll start by noting that one of the things that appears all of us can agree on, at least up here at the table, is that public faith in government in the United States has been undermined by decades of organized conservative and Republican attacks on the idea of government itself. Distrust of government today reflects the long-term effects of powerful narratives casting government as inept, or worse, as a threat and a villain, and the failure in recent decades of liberals and Democrats to develop powerful counter-narratives. To say this alone, though, I think, is to suggest that Americans have simply been duped, that there's no basis in reality for their growing frustration with American government or their belief that government does not work for them. And in this sense, I think the story offers a misleading account of what has happened if we take it on its own, and of the challenges that we confront today. Like others here, I'm strongly committed to the belief that government can be effective at doing many good things and that it's actually essential in strong form for progressively improving the life conditions of ordinary people. But like Bob suggested at the beginning of this panel, I don't think that this is necessarily what government has been doing very well lately. Public frustrations with government, I think, have roots in real conditions and developments, and we should not imagine that we can build trust in government through new frames and narratives without addressing these real political conditions as well. I think we might start by noting some important changes in the institutional realities of governance and what we might call the infrastructure of public trust in government. At the risk of stating the obvious, the United States government is a system of fragmented powers with a complex set of veto points where many actors are positioned to preserve the status quo. Right? Popular policy ideas have always died in this system through what Daniel Carpenter has called institutional strangulation. Right? The functioning of this system to get things done in a big way has always depended on more than most governments, has depended on norms and processes of collaboration across political differences on the one side, and on the other, on insurgent movements that provide strong pressures from below that force the hands of political actors through social movement activism. And in recent decades, we haven't seen very much of either. The strong political forces emerging from business mobilization and the mobilization of the religious right and other groups that moved the Republican Party far to the right created a kind of party polarization that, in concert with changes in norms and rules such as the Senate filibuster, have created a high level of paralysis in the system. As a result, Americans have repeatedly been subjected to a frustrating cycle of electoral promises that raise their hopes that something will be done about their growing problems, followed by paralyzing conflict and an inability to produce policy change. And in this environment, I think it's hardly surprising that many people respond by becoming cynical about political representatives and government action. A related result of this party polarization, of course, is that it has not only made government less effective during decades in which middle and working class Americans have been under great and growing stresses, it's also given rise to an ongoing spectacle of political dysfunction in the policy process, with the parties being engaged in a process in which we can say at this point the Republican Party can be described as having kind of opted out of the responsibility to govern and primarily being engaged in a process of trying to undermine their opponents in the Democratic Party. In fact, the most extreme elements of the Republican Party have been willing to hold the country hostage, as in the recent conflicts over the national debt ceiling, to satisfy the radical demands of the conservative base. And with few moderate Republicans left to compromise with, Democrats appear, like Republicans, to be unwilling to govern together. When Americans look to government, what they see today mainly reinforces their sense that government is a bickering mess and isn't likely to do anything helpful for them anytime soon. Third, trusting government officials and trusting government depends to some degree on a feeling of connection to government officials. And through much of the 20th century, this feeling was supported by an infrastructure of organizations such as civic associations and labor unions. Elected representatives often began their careers by working their way up through these organizations and maintained close ties once in office. Labor unions emphasized to their members which officials were on their side and had been promoted by their organization or had been appointed at their behest. In these and other ways, working and middle-class Americans had strong feelings of membership in organizations that clearly tied them in terms of identities and interests to representatives in government. Over the last 4 decades, of course, these organizations have declined in dramatic fashion. The organizational infrastructure that once tied large numbers of ordinary Americans to government has shrunk, in many cases, to a point that is alarmingly close to irrelevance. Governance is now a more distant spectacle encountered through media and seemingly out of reach. And government officials have become a them, for many people, seen as having very little real connection in a meaningful organizational way to us. Fourth, the widespread sense that government is not doing much for ordinary Americans should also be seen as a product of the structure of public policy in the United States. As Suzanne Mettler has rightly argued in a recent book, The Submerged State, Americans are largely unaware of many of the benefits they receive from government. Large public investments in opportunity and security are obscured by the fact that they're provided through obscure tax provisions, through employers, or through other private intermediaries. On the other hand, taxes and other costs imposed by government are highly visible, and so too are the benefits that target the poor, which against this backdrop appear to be forms of special treatment that invite resentment. In recent decades, this dynamic has deepened considerably as the privatization agenda has advanced and government has relied more and more on obscure policy tools for achieving public purposes. Today, the mismatch of invisible benefits and visible costs plays a central role in encouraging Americans to see themselves as making it entirely on their own and see their government in a negative light. Alongside these kinds of developments, popular views of government have also been transformed by the growing political influence of business interests and the affluent. Over the past several decades, government supports and protections for ordinary Americans have been undermined in a variety of important ways. A wide variety of life risks have been shifted from governments and corporations onto the backs of working families. As core elements of the American dream, from social mobility to the ability of low-skilled workers to have livable lives, have eroded, people rightly wonder what their government has been doing and why it has not responded more effectively. As Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson point out in their recent work, the growing power of business interests and the affluent has created cross-pressures that have left the Democratic Party adrift in a difficult position of trying to satisfy the needs of the voters who make up their coalition and to appeal to the affluent and to business interests which fund their activities. Right? Meanwhile, these same developments, the rising power of the affluent and of business interests, has fueled a more muscular Republican attack on government efforts to promote security and opportunity for ordinary Americans. Over the past 4 decades, government has become far less responsive to the needs of working and middle-class people. Recent research by Larry Bartels and Martin Gillens suggests that when policy preferences diverge between the rich and the rest of Americans, that policy actions tend to be highly responsive to the preferences of the wealthiest Americans, but has almost no statistical relationship to the preferences of almost everyone else below them. In this sense, Americans are on pretty firm empirical ground when they say that government is not really listening to them. American government has for some time now been serving business interests at the expense of workers and the affluent and at the expense of the middle and lower classes. It is against this backdrop that we must understand the deep distrust of government expressed by Americans on the left and right, for example, in the Tea Party as well as the Occupy movement. Levels of trust in government and political officials have fallen to their lowest levels on record, even lower than they were in the immediate aftermath of Watergate. But to understand these numbers, we have to see them as part of a broader loss of faith in elites and dominant institutions, including those of the market as much as the state. The anger and the distrust aimed at government is intimately tied to a sense that the state has been captured by and is serving the interests of corporations and the rich. It is not at root a pro-market form of anti-statism. Levels of trust in the major institutions of the market, such as banks, financial institutions, and corporations, are actually as low or lower than levels of trust in the federal government. And this should really be remembered. It's not discussed nearly enough. 61% of Americans now say our system unfairly favors the wealthy, and 56% state that the power of banks and other financial institutions has become a major threat to the country. These views are not just driven by policy actions that favor the advantage, they're also a response to the highly visible cycling of officials between top positions in government and on Wall Street, and between public offices and powerful corporate lobbying firms. To a significant degree, public views of government today reflect a broad and growing sense that the game is rigged, and public officials can't be trusted to look out for the interests of ordinary Americans. Finally, we should also not fail to note the debilitating effect that these shifts in political influence and public policy have had on government capacities. The agenda advanced by business interests and the affluent has undercut the tax revenues needed to sustain competent government action. Here my point fits in well with Kim's. It has rolled back regulations that protect Americans and taken the teeth out of regulatory agencies. With the exception of vast new investments in targeted areas such as the security state and the carceral state, government operations have lost a significant degree of capacity in terms of funding streams, personnel, organizational resources, and policy supports. The result is that we've entered into a vicious cycle. As government is drained of its capacity, it fails more routinely in small and spectacular ways, from the post office to Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill. These visible failures escalate negative perceptions of government, which then strengthen the hands of interests who attack government capacities in the next round of political conflict, and so on, and so on. The overarching point I want to make here is that, yes, anti-government rhetoric has played a critical role, an essential role in driving down public faith in government, but it would be a serious political error to imagine that public distrust of government is nothing more than a product of manipulation and rhetoric from the right-wing propaganda machine. Negative views of government in the American public also reflect real political developments that are happening on the ground, and we ignore these developments at our peril.
So not a lot of optimism on this panel. We want to open the discussion up to you all, but let me ask one quick question. We know there's a long history of anti-government attitude in America, and that traces all the way back. And yet, there were times when social programs were victorious. Equity was achieved, social equity was achieved. My own view of what happened in the 70s is, yes, there was a lot of rhetoric, but we had a devastating economic times, and we still have not really recovered in the 1970s, and we still have not really recovered. The wage data that Joe Stiglitz referred to is perhaps the best example of that. We have not had good economic times for 30 or 40 years, so why not blame government? But how do we return? We had victories in the 60s, we had victories in the 30s. They were perceived to work. So what do we do? How do we change? I know that's the hardest question in the world, but I'm sure all of you have at least a quick thought on that. Can we begin with Bob?
Sure. I think Joe made a really important point when he talked about insurgent movements from below. I think that there has not been enough organized pressure from however you want to characterize it, from the left, from progressives, but from people who are representing the interests of ordinary people. There has not been the same kind of organizational pressure on office holders and politicians in general as there has been on the right. And I don't think anything is going to change until that kind of pressure is somehow developed. If you, just very briefly, if you look back to the labor movement, this was organizational pressure from below, took an incredibly long period of time. If you look at the civil rights movement, the same thing. If you look at what happened with the women's movement, or if you look at the wave of the women's movement from, if you look back to the late 1960s and 1970s. So I think something similar, and I think especially on behalf of working people in this country, since I think that employment is the biggest issue facing the country, we need something along those lines. I don't see it developing, and if it doesn't develop, I don't think anything much that is substantial will change over the next few years.
Kim, you want to respond to that and add something else?
Sure. I think that I agree with Bob about the importance of insurgent movements. And I think that, I guess I would say first that while there is obviously a long history of kind of anti-government politics in the United States that the conservative movement feeds off of and taps into, and that is part of the reason for the success of some of the rhetoric that Rick and I discussed. I also think there are other strong counter tendencies in the American political tradition and in visions of what the meanings of democracy and equality and the promises of the country are. And so I think that there are other sources in our political culture to tap into, and that is what the great social movements of the 20th century were able to do, what the labor movement was able to do, what the civil rights movement was able to do, what in certain ways the anti-war movement was able to do. And I think I feel more hopeful at this moment than I would have a couple of years ago about the future, that some of the cracks in the reigning ideology that have been opened up and that the Occupy movement has helped to open up as well, I think do offer some sense of the
a possibility of something new emerging again. So I actually don't feel as pessimistic as I might have in the past.
Rick? Yeah, Jeff, let me jump off from your absolutely vital point that the American people have this tradition of individualism and hate big organizations and bureaucracies that weigh them down, but broaden it to say, like, that didn't always just apply to government. Right? The real corporations, the real giant bureaucracies that constrain our lives most intimately generally tend to be the companies we work for, the corporations. And the success of the right and the failure of the left is their ability to kind of get people, especially Tea Party people, thinking about these giant unaccountable bureaucracies as if they were like small businesses. And in fact, there was, I think I remember reading recently, there was some politician referred to small businesses and their overseas branches or something like that. By not figuring out a way to talk about this, the Democrats forfeit a language of freedom and liberty. And by the way that Tea Party folk talk about big businesses as if it were small businesses really well handled in Tom Frank's latest book, Pity the Billionaires, that basically they talk about, Bank of America as this, institution that was unfairly put upon by government, just like my plumbing supply contractor company. Here's a great example of the forfeit of a discourse of liberty. How many times, I would say barely ever, have you heard a Democrat defend healthcare reform by saying, imagine the entrepreneurial dynamism we could unleash in our economy if people with a good idea, which are the great Americans that we all love and the moral heart of our nation, had the freedom to quit their job and start a small business because they didn't have to fear losing their health care because they only get it to their job. I think it was Senator Arlen Spector. They don't want to be unfair. I think it was someone from Pennsylvania, maybe it was Bob Casey, who someone said, why don't you guys say that more often? And he said, oh, I never heard that before. So, talk about freedom instead of, the wonky technocratic aspects of the healthcare law.
But beyond that, I think it is important to recognize that, as Kim's work highlights so well, there isn't necessarily an opposition here between the sort of material achievements in government and the rhetoric. These things both flow from building organizational capacity and power, and that many of the arguments we associate with the right's success in American politics in recent decades were advanced over a much longer period of time through various organizations and through concerted investments and efforts, and that same thing needs to happen for progressives as well. In terms of a particular kind of narrative, I think it's very interesting that at a recent conference that I was at, and Dorian was at, and Lane was at, Mark Rank at Washington University reported on some work he's been doing on how people think about the American dream. And that people often assume that Americans think about the American dream in terms of rags to riches, with the idea of moving up to riches. And that what he's found is, in his research, is that the number one idea that people associate with the American dream is actually security. That it's actually the idea of being at a comfortable level and being secure in that. And we've really lost some notion of that as we've sort of talked about as the ownership society and the idea that people don't really want all this risk necessarily. And there's a language of security out there that's important, and one that connects with the language, and it's important because it connects with the language of freedom, right? I mean, why are Americans free today as they grow up to move across the country? Why do they have so much geographic mobility and don't stay at home in the home that they grew up in? It's partly because Social Security helps to take care of their parents, and Medicare helps to take care of their parents. Particularly the youngest daughters of families used to be expected routinely to stay at home, or people used to have to take their parents in and stay where they were. Why are people free to take risks in many cases in an entrepreneurial sense? Because they have certain protections that catch them if they fall. That there is a certain amount of enhancing freedom that comes from a kind of security that one can do so. And then lastly, I'll go back to a conversation we were having before the panel started, where Bob said something about the importance of jobs and a sort of missed opportunity in the Obama administration. Some of what I was saying before in my talk, I think it is essential that we find ways to accomplish highly visible actions in government that speak directly to people's needs and problems right now. And certainly the economic crisis has been a serious opportunity for that to have happened, and it is not in some ways, with the healthcare law being a possible exception, depending on how you want to argue it. But I think it's essential that we accomplish things with government and through government that speak directly to the problems people are confronting right now and the stagnation of their life conditions.
It was always my deepest wish that Obama's priority would be to show people how government can work and do something and talk about it all the time. It was my wish. Let me throw it open. And let's keep on these issues a little bit, because I think there's lots more to explore. You had your hand up early, David.
Thanks, Jeff. One of the things that I think...
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. I'm David Gold. I'm a professor here at the New School in International Affairs. One of the things that I felt was a little missing was foreign policy and international affairs. Bob Herbert reminded us about Lyndon Johnson. We tend to think of Johnson in terms of Vietnam, but in addition to the soaring rhetoric of the Great Society, there are also some very, very important successes. Medicare, civil rights, voting rights. But Vietnam can also be seen as a response to the soft on communism charge that originated with the right wing after World War II. And I think people should remember that the targets of people like Nixon and McCarthy were New Deal liberals. And that there's this constant theme running through American politics since World War II about being tough on our foreign enemies. And Vietnam is an example, and of course, Bush's macho posturing around 9/11 and Iraq. And I think a lot of this can be fit into what the panel has been talking about in terms of why basically liberal administrations run off the track. And we saw this, Truman in Korea, Kennedy, Johnson in Vietnam, Clinton to some extent, and now even Obama. Guantanamo is still open, despite his promises. And so the notion of government failure isn't just about domestic issues. The big failures have been foreign policy, and many of them have been the result of liberal administrations who get the U.S. involved in foreign adventures which are failures or are perceived as failures.
Thank you, David. Interesting points. Any responses from the panel?
I have a quick one. I can talk a little bit more about Reagan in the 70s, which is what my research is on now for my next book. Barack Obama was never more Reagan-like. We've all sort of puzzled over why he said Reagan was his role model as a president, and the kind of answers have kind of been, well, he was really successful. He was Obama has a sympathy for this kind of free market ideology, but I think he was never more Reagan-like than when he said, when asked after his election how he would respond to the crimes of the Bush administration involving their persecution of the war on terror. Well, in America, we don't look backward; we look forward. So that's sort of punting on foreign policy accountability, and well, this kind of definitely would contribute to the sense that, well, we can't do anything about it. These kind of wars just kind of grow of their own accord. We end one like a balloon, and we squeeze it and it comes out somewhere else. We end Iraq, we get Iran. We end Afghanistan, we get Yemen.
Can I
Yeah.
comment?
Yeah.
I made the joke that I didn't really know Lyndon Johnson. Well, Lyndon Johnson drafted my butt in 1965, so I do remember Lyndon Johnson. I lucked out, did not go to Vietnam. I went to Korea, but a lot of my buddies went to Vietnam and some were lost. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think that, and in fact, I mentioned in my remarks that I thought that this disenchantment with the government, this loss of confidence, began with Vietnam, and it's been a series of catastrophes. I mean, Iraq was an insane war, And now with Obama on Afghanistan, I favored going into Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks, but that was September 11th, 2001. This is 2012. And if we do not stop fighting these insane wars, we're never going to get our act together domestically. And then just the final point is that I do agree that with so many of the Democratic presidents, it's a response to this constant harping from conservatives about being tough on foreign foes, about not having lost China, or about being soft on communism and this sort of thing. And I think it was absolutely the case with Lyndon Johnson. And I think it's the same thing with Obama. I mean, he came to prominence as an anti-war figure in his opposition to the war in Iraq, but he kept referring to Afghanistan as the good war, and he does not want to be seen as the weak president who cuts and runs from Afghanistan in the same way that Johnson did not want to cut and run from Vietnam.
Any other quick comments from the panel? We don't have too much time, so I'm going to try and get as many questions in as we can. Comments from the panel on the foreign policy?
I just would say very quickly, I think I completely agree that there is some of this responding to the right. At the same time, I also think that you can't let the Democratic Party off the hook quite so easily, and that throughout the post-war period, there are very deep commitments to anti-communism that it really inform what the Democratic Party is doing, and at various moments. So I don't think it's purely responsive. I would just say I think it's also a broader failure of, you can debate the points, but a broader political tendency.
Let me, there's somebody behind you, Peter, and then Peter. Yes, sir. You had your hand up for a while. Let's keep everything as brief as possible. So just thank you.
Ned Hodgman, I'm from a nonprofit called Understanding Government in Washington, D.C., and my question is reflecting on Barry Lynn's article in the January issue of Harper's, in which he talked about it's called monopolies, regarding monopolies and killing competition. It's called Killing the Competition, the article. And my question, what he points out in the article, is that independent producers in America, and especially people who work for commodity producers and conglomerates who run, who buy from American producers, especially in the food industry, are being pressured, highly pressured by hidden pricing mechanisms that prevent them from being independent actors on the economic stage. The larger point is that we have entrepreneurs in America who could be willing participants in a democratic renewal, in working with government as a progressive force. And I'm wondering whether the panelists see entrepreneurs as a group of people who could be activated, in fact, to embrace a more pro-government vision based on antitrust and anti-monopoly policy.
Any thoughts on that?
This is not my area of expertise, but I would be skeptical.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure that entrepreneurs and small businessmen aren't already there. I mean, when the Pew poll, the Pew Center on the People of the Press, when they did their poll every 2 years on people's attitudes towards government, for some reason they didn't ask this question in 2007. But I think, I don't remember the number, but it was a strong majority of small business people said they favored raising the minimum wage by $2. So, I mean, it's not as lost a cause as I think intuition would suggest.
Any other thoughts? Well, there's not only monopoly issues, of course, there's healthcare issues, there's pension issues for small entrepreneurs, and so forth. So monopoly is part of it, obviously. Peter.
Peter Linder, University of California, Davis. Instead of throwing in yet another fresh idea as a common comment from the floor, I want to underline definite difference, a theme already enunciated, and Edward's comments also did this too. Go back to Joe's comment on ramping up the discussion of freedom. Follow that line. That's the line that deserves a lot of strength here, as it did in the work of Amartya Sen, for example. Freedom in this discourse. Freedom for whom? Why has freedom been freedom for such a very small sector of American society? Follow that.
Any comments on that?
Hear, hear.
Just to agree, yeah.
I will add one brief comment, which is to say that not just the language of freedom, but also the freedom of choice, which has become so remarkably tied to the notion of individual choice that we've lost any notion of democracy and democratically controlled government institutions as an instrument of us choosing together to pursue certain ends. And for example, in the school setting, the association of the language of choice solely with the idea of exercising influence through individual exit, where you give up on one school because it's not working right and go to another, as opposed to the idea of choosing together what kind of school we want to have in our neighborhood, and actually taking ownership of it in some sense, in a political sense. That reconnection of the language of choice to democracy and the sort of undercutting of it being used solely for the power of promoting market-based individual action is important.
Yeah, I'm just very quickly, I'm always stunned by the exploitation of the notion of freedom from the right wing, but Milton Friedman's book was Capitalism and Freedom. Hayek was The Road to Serfdom. But I come back, but Amartya Sen's notion of freedom is a little more complex. We need capabilities, or the positive versus negative freedom argument. And we sometimes come back to that they've always had a simple version of freedom that seems to have been effective.
It doesn't necessarily have to be complex. I mean, freedom at the workplace, void where prohibited, the book on, how people don't have the freedom to go to the bathroom. It's not
I
complicated.
agree. Where are the leaders who are willing to talk about that on the side? Yes, sir.
Exactly.
Tom Hilbing from the Open Society Foundations. I'm wondering, somebody who could have been on this panel and added another perspective is Kevin Cruz in his book White Flight, which talks about the origins of American conservatism in Atlanta during the civil rights era. And I know, Kim, you mentioned this and then kind of downplayed it, but I wonder if you could all talk about the kind of grassroots conservatism and anti-government rhetoric that arose as a way of pushing back against integration and equality.
Well, I just think, I started off by saying that I didn't think the hostility to government was as strong as some people might think. But what I think is things have gotten just distorted to a fairly well. So people have lost confidence in government, but one of the things that has prevented government from working for the past half century, in my view, is the racial rhetoric and the racial reality in this country. And so what you would think, especially if you were looking in economic terms at what would be normal alliances, never emerged because of the rhetoric of racial prejudice and because of the rhetoric of divisiveness that has been pursued, and then in the Republican Party with the Southern strategy and that sort of thing, raised to absolute strategic importance. And so it becomes eventually a case of divide and conquer. And then it becomes a peculiar sense of minority rule in this country, and it is contributed to a tremendous degree to the income and wealth inequality in this country and the amassing of power by the very tiny sliver of those at the top of the economic pyramid.
Other comments?
Yeah, if I can. Because I was focusing on some of the institutional developments in government, I really didn't focus on the discourse as much in my comments, because others were doing that. But most of my work is on race and poverty politics in the United States. And I should say that, especially in the most recent book I've come out with some other people, Richard Fording and Sandy Schramm, we make the argument that really the sort of underclass discourse and the sort of highly racialized narratives that emerged in conflicts over poverty policy in this country in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s and 90s really were central to both binding together the conservative coalition, which was at odds on a variety of other issues, whereas an agreement in that area, and also really served as kind of Exhibit A for impugning liberal ideas about what government can and should do. sort of served as the primary case for arguing that attempts to use government to pursue the good resulted in perverse incentives, encouraged bad behavior, led people to not improve their lives, stop striving, killed off civil society organizations. A lot of these arguments that were formed in that arena really became generalized to Dick Armey's later statement in promoting the ownership society idea that to speak about collective responsibility is just a code word for saying personal irresponsibility, right? And these ideas get sort of born in that highly racialized cauldron of poverty politics and then spread outward from there. And I think it's very telling that even if you go back to the California anti-tax propositions, right, Prop 13, the evidence at the time indicated that a lot of the public support for that actually was driven by racial resentments, right? And these things have always been sort of interconnected.
Yeah.
We have time for one last question.
Sorry.
Let me go here, and then we'll try to squeeze it in.
My name is Tanya Mielich, and I've been in the political world for 40 years. And you have not discussed the political institutions. You've talked about how one manipulates them, but one of the things that has amazed me over the years is how little perception there is about how important the census is and the redrawing of the lines. And we have a situation here in New York that is absolutely disgraceful, where we have, again, a governor who knows better, has turned against, and they pushed the issue off again. So my question is, in your analysis of what happened, would you discuss the disintegration of the political dynamic of drawing lines, making legislatures work, et cetera, the kinds of things that Common Cause started, 1972, and now we're doing it again.
Well, there are also the limitation on voting rights as well these
Yeah.
days. But can you address this quickly?
A friend of a lot of ours, Tom Gagan, has a fascinating lawsuit in Illinois in which he's making a First Amendment case against gerrymandering, saying if you're saying this bunch of people has to be in a district of this shape because they have a lot of people who think this way, i.e. are Democrats, and a lot of people think that way, that he thinks that can reach some hurdles, past some legal hurdles that have thwarted gerrymandering cases before. And I've read his brief, and it's great stuff.
Just for the sake of time, Helen, quickly, we have 1 minute.
Helen Ginsberg, National Jobs for All Coalition and Brooklyn College. I'm addressing this, of course, to Bob Herbert. How do you account for the fact that direct job creation, which was a hallmark of the New Deal, has been completely obliterated from the political talk?
I think that gets to the essence of what we're talking about now, because that is government completely and directly involved in what so many have argued should be the complete free market realm. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, direct job creation, which I favor, is incredibly expensive. It's a very expensive proposition. It's an investment that I think that we should make, but it's very expensive. And we have this low tax environment with high deficits. And then one added aspect is that there would, it hasn't been part of the conversation because we haven't talked about it much, but there would be a racial aspect to that too, because it would be seen as that helping too much those people. So we'd be spending a lot of money to blah, 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 blah. So I think that for those reasons and others, no one even bothers to touch the whole issue of direct job creation.
The Rediscovering Government project is going to continue to discuss these issues. This is the beginning. The very idea of it is that we will continue to analyze, have more public forums, and publish, and I hope publish the papers that are presented here on our website, and keep this discussion going. We will talk about low taxes and tax revolts and starve the beast strategies and all that kind of thing in future events. But let's take a break and reconvene in 10 or 12 minutes.
Yeah. So you guys like dash off like now.